Hello there, and welcome to Edge of Mind. Somewhere out on the open grassland, the wind never really stops. It moves across the steppe in long, slow waves, bending the grass one way, then the other, finding no wall to slow it, no city to interrupt it, nothing between it and the horizon, but more of the same pale, rolling earth. This is where the story begins. Not in Rome, not in any palace or senate chamber, but out here, where the sky is so wide, it seems to press down gently on everything beneath it, and where the measure of a life is not stone or gold, but movement, always movement. The people who lived on this land were called the Huns, and for a long time the settled world to the west knew almost nothing about them. They had come from somewhere further east, drifting slowly across the great grasslands over generations, following the grass and the water and the seasons in the way their people always had. They were not wanderers in the aimless sense. They knew exactly where they were going, and they knew how to read the land in ways that no Roman surveyor ever could. They moved because movement was survival. They moved because the steppe rewarded those who understood it, and quietly swallowed those who did not. And before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now. What part of the world are you watching from tonight? Whether it's late where you are, or just getting quiet, drop it in the comments. It's always so lovely to see where these evenings find people. The Huns were horsemen before they were anything else. A child among them grew up on horseback in a way that is difficult to fully imagine. Not learning to ride as a skill acquired later in life, but living alongside horses from the very beginning, understanding them the way a person understands their own hands. The horse was not a tool, it was something closer to a partner, and the bond between a Hun warrior and his mount was built over years of quiet, daily closeness that no amount of Roman cavalry training could easily replicate. Their bows were short and curved, made from layers of bone and sinew, pressed carefully together and held under slow, steady tension over a long period of time. From horseback, a Hun archer could release an arrow with enough force and accuracy to reach a target at distances that seemed almost impossible to those who faced them. They did not need to stop moving. They did not need to stand still and form a line. They moved while they fought, which meant the rules of engagement that Roman commanders had spent generations learning simply did not apply in the same way. The shape of the battle changed before it had even fully begun. Their camps were not cities. They had no temples, no forums, no stone walls rising against the sky. What they had were wagons and tents, arranged in patterns that could be broken down and reassembled with a kind of practiced ease. A Hunnic settlement could vanish from a riverbank and reappear somewhere else within days, leaving almost nothing behind. To the Roman world, which measured civilization in permanence, in marble and mortar and roads that lasted centuries, this was deeply unsettling. A people who left no mark on the land were a people who could not be anticipated, could not be tracked, could not be understood through the usual methods. Their leaders held power through loyalty and through the ability to deliver land, cattle, plunder, safety. There was no palace to inherit, no bloodline that automatically conferred authority. A leader among the Huns had to earn his position again and again, through the trust of the men around him, and through a kind of personal force that could not be sustained by appearance alone. This shaped everything about the way power moved among them. It made their leaders lean and watchful, and deeply attuned to the people they led, because the alternative was to be quietly set aside. By the middle of the 4th century, the Huns had begun moving westward with more purpose. The reasons for this are not entirely clear even now. Some historians point to drought, others to pressure from peoples further east, others simply to the natural logic of expansion, when a strong confederation finds open space ahead of it. Whatever the cause, the movement was real, and its effects were felt almost immediately by the peoples who lived in its path. The Goths, who had settled along the edges of Roman territory, found themselves pressed from behind. Many of them crossed the Danube into Roman lands, seeking shelter. Rome took them in, managed them poorly, and within a few years found itself at a battle it would not forget, at a place called Adrianople. The Huns had not yet arrived at Rome's door, but they had already set the first thing gently in motion. This was the world into which Attila was born, somewhere around the year 400. The exact date is lost. The steppe kept no written records, and the Romans who would eventually write about him were writing about a man they feared rather than one they truly knew. What can be said? is that he was born into a family of standing. His uncle Ruger was a leader among the Huns, a man who had already begun the slow work of drawing the various clans together into something more unified, more directed, more capable of exerting real pressure on the empires that lay to the south and west. Attila grew up inside that world: the horses, the open sky, the careful politics of loyalty and strength, the gradual understanding that power was not given but held. He learned what the steppe taught, and he learned it well, but something else was coming. Something that would shape him in a way that no other Hunnic leader had been shaped before. A journey was coming, a long stay in a very different world. And when he returned from it, he would see the empire that had hosted him, not with wonder, but with the clear and patient eyes of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. The story of Attila the Hun is only just beginning to take its shape. He arrived in Rome as a boy, not as a conqueror, not as a diplomat, not as anyone who mattered yet, simply as a child who had been sent away from everything he knew and placed inside the most powerful city in the world. This was how empires managed the people they could not quite control. They took the children of important families and kept them close, educated them, showed them marble and aqueducts and the long colonnaded walks of Roman courts. The idea was that a boy raised inside Rome would return home with Roman values woven into him. He would be grateful, or at least familiar. He would be in some quiet way, manageable. What Rome did not always account for was what the boy might be learning on his own. The arrangement had a name. It was called a hostage exchange, though the word hostage carried less weight than it sounds today. These were not prisoners in the ordinary sense. They were housed and fed and educated, and they moved through Roman society with a degree of freedom that might have seemed generous to anyone watching from the outside. They attended ceremonies and sat near men of rank and watched the machinery of empire operate from a closer distance than most Romans ever achieved. It was, in its way, an extraordinary education, and Attila received it at a time when Rome was still vast and still impressive, but also, if you looked carefully, beginning to show the places where its weight was resting on something less solid than it once had been. He would have been given Roman clothing and Roman tutors. He would have eaten at Roman tables and walked Roman streets, and seen the forums and the baths and the careful theater of power that Rome staged for itself every single day. A Roman senator moving through the city in his white toga was performing something, a statement about order, about civilization, about the rightness of things as they were. Attila would have watched all of this with the eyes of someone who had grown up in a world where that kind of performance was simply not available. On the steppe, a man was what he could do. Here, a man was also what he appeared to be. That difference would not have been lost on him. There was another boy in Rome around the same time, a young Roman of military family named Aetius, who had himself spent time among the Huns as part of a similar arrangement. The two may well have known each other during these years, moving through overlapping circles, watching each other across the careful distance that separated their worlds. What passed between them, if anything, is not recorded, but the fact of it lingers. Two boys, two futures, two men, who would one day face each other across a battlefield in Gaul, each shaped in part by the world the other came from. Attila watched Rome the way a person watches something they are trying to understand completely. He would have seen its wealth, the sheer accumulation of it, the marble and the grain and the endless movement of goods from one end of the empire to the other. He would have seen its army, or at least the version of it that Rome showed to visitors, organized, disciplined, impressive in its formations and its equipment. But he would also have seen something else, something that perhaps only someone from outside could see clearly. He would have seen how much of Rome's power rested on the belief that Rome was powerful. The empire ran, in part, on reputation, on the assumption that its reach was endless, and its response to defiance would be swift and overwhelming. And that reputation was real. It had been earned over centuries of expansion and endurance. But reputation, Attila may have understood, was also something that could be tested, something that could be worn slowly down, something that could be made to work against itself, if you knew exactly where to press. He spent his years in Rome absorbing all of it, the language, the customs, the rhythms of diplomacy, the way that Roman officials spoke to each other and to foreigners. He learned the gap between what was said and what was meant. He learned how the empire negotiated and what it valued, and what it quietly feared. And because he was a boy from the steppe, from a world that valued directness and personal strength above ceremony. He may have found the distance between Roman appearance and Roman reality more visible than it was to the Romans themselves. When he returned to the world of the Huns, he carried all of that with him, not as admiration, but as knowledge. The kind of knowledge that changes how you see the thing you are looking at. Rome was no longer a distant and unknowable power. It was a system he had walked through and studied and quietly measured. He knew its rhythms, he knew its pressure points, he knew the men who moved through its corridors and the language they used to protect what they had. He was still young when he came home. His uncle Ruger was still leading the Huns, still drawing the clans into a tighter shape, still pressing against the edges of Roman influence with the patient confidence of a man who sensed the advantage was gradually shifting. Attila returned to this world and found his place within it, watching still, learning still, but now with something steadier and sharper behind his eyes. The boy who had left for Rome had been curious. The young man who returned was something more than that. He had seen the empire from the inside, and he had measured the distance between its image and its reality. And he had come home understanding something that would shape everything that followed, that the most powerful empire in the world was not invincible. It was only very good at appearing to be. The years ahead would bring his brother Bleda, and the question of how two men share a power that was never truly meant to be divided. Ruger had held the Huns together through patience and pressure, drawing the scattered clans into something that resembled a single force, not through ceremony, but through the slow accumulation of loyalty and fear. He had pressed against Roman borders with a steadiness that the empire found difficult to ignore, and into this world already in motion, already leaning toward something larger than it had been, Attila quietly returned and found his place within it. He was not yet a leader. He was a young man with sharp eyes and a quiet manner, moving through a court that understood strength in its most direct form. The steppe did not reward subtlety for its own sake. It rewarded results, and so Attila watched his uncle, as he had watched the Romans, carefully, and without rushing toward anything. The years passed slowly, as they do when a person is learning rather than acting. Ruger continued to press the Eastern Empire for tribute, for recognition, for the kind of deference that signals to everyone watching that the balance of power has shifted. He was not entirely without success. The Huns under his leadership had become something Rome could not simply dismiss. But Ruger was aging, and the question of what came next was one that everyone in the Hunnic world was quietly carrying. When Ruger died, somewhere around the year 434, leadership passed to his nephews, to Attila, and to his older brother Bleda. This was not unusual among the Huns. Power was often shared among those who carried the blood of the previous leader, held together through agreement and mutual need. But shared power is always a particular kind of arrangement. It requires two people to want the same things, or at least to want them in the same direction. Bleda was older. In many traditions, that would have made him the primary figure, the one whose name would be spoken first. And in the early years of their joint rule, he may well have been. He was not a man without ability. He led raids and campaigns alongside his brother, and the Huns continued to press against the empire's borders with the same steady confidence they had shown under Ruger. From the outside, the arrangement may have appeared settled enough, but the arrangement was never quite what it appeared. Attila had returned from Rome carrying something that Bleda had not. He had walked through the corridors of the most organized political system the world had yet produced. He had learned how power was constructed from the inside, not just how it looked, but how it functioned, where it held, and where it gave way. Bleda had grown up among the Huns, learning the world as it presented itself on the steppe. The two brothers shared blood and shared authority. They did not entirely share a way of seeing. In the early years of their joint reign, they negotiated with the Eastern Empire together. A meeting was held with Roman officials near the Danube, the river that had long served as a kind of boundary between the Roman world and the world beyond it. The Huns arrived on horseback. They refused to dismount. It was a deliberate gesture, the kind that says something without saying it aloud. We are not your subjects. We are not your guests. We are something else entirely. The agreement that followed required Rome to double the annual tribute it paid to the Huns. It also required Rome to return any Huns who had fled into Roman territory, and to treat Hun merchants as equals in trade. Each of those terms had been chosen with care. Together they formed something more than a negotiation. They formed a statement, one that Rome was being asked to sign with its own hand. Rome had made concessions before. It had paid tribute before, had reached agreements with foreign peoples before. But the terms of this particular arrangement carried a different weight. The Huns were not asking to be absorbed into the Roman system. They were asking Rome to acknowledge, in practical and measurable ways, that the Huns occupied a position the empire could not afford to ignore. The tribute was not simply money, it was a signal, sent in the only language that empires truly understand. Attila's hand in shaping that negotiation is difficult to measure precisely, but the approach, the refusal to dismount, the insistence on equality, the demand for something concrete rather than symbolic, carries the marks of someone who understood how Roman officials thought about status and precedent, someone who had learned that the form of a negotiation can matter as much as its content, and sometimes more. The years of joint rule were productive in that way. Campaigns continued, the Hunnic reach extended, and the tribute kept arriving steadily from the east. But underneath the shared authority, something was slowly finding its shape. Two men with different natures and different kinds of knowledge do not hold equal power indefinitely. One eventually moves ahead, not always through conflict, but sometimes simply through the gradual weight of presence and decision. The court that surrounded them was watching, as courts always do, for the direction the wind was settling. Bleda remained, he led, he ruled alongside his brother through years that were, from the outside, a period of growing Hunnic strength. But the tension between two leaders who are not quite the same kind of leader is a quiet thing. It does not always announce itself. It lives in the space between decisions, in the small differences between how one man reads a situation and how another does. What became of that tension belongs to the next part of the story. But it is worth sitting with the shape of this moment. Two brothers sharing a world that was growing larger and more complicated beneath them, each carrying something the other did not, each moving forward in the same direction while remaining in some essential way separate. The Huns were strong, the empire was paying, and Attila was watching, still patient as he had always been, and waiting for the moment when shared power would no longer be the shape of things. The moment when shared power ends is rarely a loud one. It does not always arrive with confrontation or ceremony. Sometimes it comes quietly, like a season changing, the air simply different one morning, and the arrangement that existed the day before, no longer quite the same. Bleda died in 445. The sources that remain from that time do not agree on how. Some suggest a hunting accident. Others imply something less accidental. The truth has grown dim over the centuries, worn smooth by time and by the particular silence that tends to settle around events that powerful men have reason not to explain. What the sources do agree on is what followed. Attila became the sole ruler of the Hunnic world, and the shape of everything changed. There is a temptation to read the death of Bleda as the moment Attila had been waiting for. That may be too simple. The two brothers had built something real together. Campaigns conducted, territory extended, tribute secured. Bleda was not merely an obstacle, he was a ruler in his own right, and the Hunnic world had held room for both of them, for a time. But time has a way of narrowing, and the space that two leaders share tends to grow smaller as one of them grows larger. Whatever the circumstances of Bleda's death, Attila did not pause for long. He moved forward, as he always had, with the particular steadiness of someone who had already been thinking about what came next. What came next was a court, not a Roman court, with its marble and its hierarchy and its elaborate rituals of precedence. Something quieter, and in its own way more deliberate. Attila's seat of power was in the great plains of what is now Hungary, a wooden hall rather than a palace, surrounded by the movement and sound of a people who had never built their lives around walls. Visitors who came to him, ambassadors and envoys, and men who needed things from him, described a place that was both simpler and more ordered than they had expected. One of those visitors was a man named Priscus. He was a Greek diplomat who traveled to Attila's court in the early 450s and left behind one of the only first-hand accounts of the man that has survived. What Priscus described was not the figure that Roman fear had constructed, not a creature of pure violence and appetite. He found instead a man who sat among his guests and ate from a wooden plate while they ate from silver ones. A man who was watchful at his own feasts, measured in his words, and careful about what he allowed others to see. The wooden plate is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. It was not poverty, Attila's court had silver and gold in abundance. The tribute flowing steadily from Rome had seen to that. The choice to eat from wood while his guests ate from finer things was something else entirely. It was a kind of statement, made without words, in the way that the most considered statements often are. He was telling everyone present that he had no need to display what he possessed, that the wealth surrounding him was incidental, that he himself was the thing of substance in the room. Priscus also noted that Attila was not tall. His head was large, and his eyes were small and watchful, set in a face that gave very little away. He moved without hurry. He spoke without raising his voice, and the people around him, the commanders, the nobles, the men who had fought beside him for years, watched him with something that Priscus described as a kind of careful attention. Not the attention of people who are afraid of what a man might do, the attention of people who understand that the man in front of them is always thinking, and that it is worth knowing which direction his thoughts are moving. This was the court that Attila had built, or perhaps more accurately, the court that had gathered around him, drawn by the gravity of someone who had learned, in the years of watching and waiting and ruling alongside another, exactly what kind of presence commands a room without demanding it. He did not perform power, he simply occupied it, the way a stone occupies the center of a stream, shaping the water around it without moving at all. The Hunnic world that he now led alone was not a simple thing to hold. It was vast, and it was made of many peoples, not only Huns, but Goths and Gepids, and others who had come under the Hunnic reach over the years. Each of these groups had their own leaders, their own customs, their own reasons for remaining loyal, or for considering other arrangements. Holding them together required more than military strength. It required the kind of authority that people feel before they can name it, the sense that the person at the center of things understands what everyone else needs, and has already thought further ahead than anyone else in the room. Attila understood this. He had been learning it since he was a young man in a Roman court. Watching how the powerful managed the people around them, he had carried that education back across the frontier, and added to it everything the steppe had taught him: patience, movement, the reading of distance and weather, and the mood of men. The result was something that Rome, with all its centuries of statecraft, had not quite seen before. He was generous to those who served him, and steady in his resolve toward those who did not. He rewarded loyalty not with gold alone but with proximity, the sense of being seen and valued by the one person whose attention mattered most in that world. And he made clear, without ever needing to say it plainly, that the circle of his attention could narrow as easily as it widened. The court settled around him. The campaigns that would follow were still gathering themselves on the horizon, still taking shape in the long conversations and slow decisions of those years. But the man who would conduct them was already fully formed, patient, watchful, and alone, now at the center of the largest force the Western world had faced in living memory. The East was watching him, and he had not yet begun. The East had been watching for some time, far to the south and east, in a city of gold walls and deep, careful ceremony. A different kind of ruler was weighing what he saw. Theodosius II governed from Constantinople, the eastern half of what had once been a single Roman Empire, now long divided and managing its own affairs from behind some of the most formidable walls in the known world. He was not a soldier by nature. He was a man of documents and delegations, more at ease among administrators than among commanders. His court was elaborate, his defenses considerable, but the thing that held the Eastern Empire together most reliably was not its armies. It was its capacity to negotiate, to find the price of peace and pay it before the alternative became too costly to imagine. Attila understood this about Theodosius long before the two men ever exchanged a formal word. The Hunnic campaigns into the Eastern Empire did not begin as a single great movement. They came in waves, pressure applied, then eased, then applied again from a different direction. Attila moved his forces across the Danube and into Roman territory, not always to hold what he crossed through, but to demonstrate what holding it would cost. Towns fell, supply lines grew uncertain. The roads that Roman administrators depended on for communication and control became unreliable in ways that no amount of garrison strength could fully address. The message was not written in any letter or delivered by any ambassador. It arrived in the silence that followed each crossing, in the reports that made their way back to Constantinople, in the numbers that grew harder to look at with each new season. Theodosius paid The first arrangements were modest enough that the Eastern court could frame them as something other than tribute. A gesture of goodwill between neighboring powers, the language of diplomacy is patient and flexible, and it can hold a great deal of uncomfortable truth inside a polite container. But the amounts grew, and the intervals between payments shortened, and the conditions that Attila placed on each new agreement became less easy to dress in softer language. He asked for the return of Huns who had crossed into Roman territory and sought shelter there. Some had fled his authority, some had simply drifted across the frontier over the years, as people do when borders are long and the land does not care which side of a line a person stands on. Theodosius resisted this at first, which was perhaps understandable. Returning people to a ruler who had reason to be displeased with them was not a comfortable thing to agree to. But Attila waited. He applied pressure in the way he had always applied it, not through a single overwhelming act, but through the slow accumulation of smaller ones, each a little harder to absorb than the last. The Huns who had sought Roman protection were eventually returned. What followed was a period of campaigns that moved more deeply into the Balkans than anything the Eastern Empire had faced in a very long time. Attila crossed the Danube with forces that Roman commanders found difficult to meet in open field, not because the Hunnic armies were impossibly large, but because they moved in ways that Roman strategy had not been built to answer. They did not besiege cities in the slow, methodical way that Roman armies had refined over centuries. They moved around them, past them, through the surrounding countryside, gradually severing the connections that made a city worth holding in the first place. Some cities fell, others were simply left in stillness, isolated, left to their own calculations about how long they could endure. The Eastern court sent ambassadors. Attila received them with the same measured courtesy he extended to everyone who came to his court, unhurried, attentive, never quite revealing how much he had already decided before they arrived. The negotiations were long. The Roman ambassadors wrote accounts of what they observed, and those accounts survive in fragments. Among them, Priscus recorded something quieter than the usual diplomatic reports. He encountered a Roman citizen living among the Huns, who had chosen to remain there rather than return to the empire. The man said plainly that life under Attila, for those who served him honestly, was more steady and more predictable than life under Roman law, where the powerful preyed on the weak with the full protection of the legal system. It was a small observation, noted almost in passing, but it suggested something about what Attila had built, not only a military force, but a world that people, given a choice, sometimes preferred to the one they had left. The tribute that Theodosius eventually agreed to was not a small thing. The annual payment reached levels that strained the Eastern treasury and required taxes that pressed heavily on the people who bore them. The Eastern Empire was not broken by this. It was too large and too deeply rooted for that. But it was changed. The wealth that flowed steadily across the Danube was a kind of acknowledgement, written in gold, that the balance of power along that frontier had shifted in ways that no amount of diplomatic language could fully conceal. Attila did not press the East to its limit. He took what it offered and watched what remained. He had learned patience in a Roman court as a young man, and patience had not stopped serving him. The East had been managed, the West had been watching, and somewhere in the courts of the Western Empire, an old acquaintance of Attila's was beginning to understand that the quiet along the Danube was not the end of something, it was the beginning of a turn. The Western Empire breathed differently than the East. It was older in its habits, slower in its movements, and it carried within it a kind of weariness that the Eastern court, for all its difficulties, had not yet fully settled into. The cities of the West were still magnificent in places, Rome itself, and Ravenna, where the Western court had moved its residents some decades before, sheltered behind its marshes and its walls. But the edges of the Western Empire had grown soft in ways that no amount of ceremony could disguise. Along those edges the Huns had long been present, not as enemies, but as something more complicated than that. For years, Hun riders had served in Roman armies, hired as cavalry and valued for their speed. They carried short composite bows that could be drawn from horseback, with a steadiness that Roman archers on foot could rarely match. They were familiar figures in the West, known even in certain circles, trusted. And at the center of that complicated familiarity stood one Roman in particular, a man named Aetius. He had grown up knowing the Huns in a way that almost no other Roman of his generation could claim. As a young man, He had been sent to live among them as a diplomatic hostage, in much the same arrangement that had once brought Attila to Roman courts. He had ridden with them and learned something of their language. He had learned something of their ways, and something of what they valued in a man. He returned to Roman service, shaped by that time in ways he may not have fully understood himself, carrying within him a knowledge of the steppe that would prove, over the years, to be among the most useful things any Western Roman general possessed. Aetius rose steadily through the turbulent politics of the Western court. The West in those years was a place where power shifted without warning, where emperors were young or compromised, and where the men who commanded armies held the real weight of authority. Aetius moved through that uncertainty with a kind of careful steadiness, building alliances, surviving reversals, returning from setbacks that would have ended other careers. He became in time the dominant military figure in the Western Empire. Some called him the last of the Romans. It was meant as a compliment, though it carried within it a quiet acknowledgement of how much had already been lost. His connection to Attila was real, and it had been useful to both of them. There had been years when Hunnic forces fought under Aetius's command, helping him secure his position within the Western court, against rivals and against the pressure of other peoples moving along the Rhine and the Danube. The relationship between the two men was not friendship in any simple sense. It was something more like a long mutual understanding between two people who had each looked at the other clearly and found something they could work with. But the world had shifted. The tribute flowing out of the Eastern court had changed the shape of Attila's ambitions. He had tested the East and found its limits. He had watched it yield, and he had taken careful note of what yielding looked like. The West was different, more fractured perhaps, but also more exposed. Its frontiers were longer and less defended. Its treasury was thinner. Its emperor was a young man named Valentinian, whose authority rested more on his name than on any particular strength of his own. Aetius understood this. He had spent years managing the Western Empire's vulnerabilities with the tools available to him, which sometimes meant Hunnic soldiers, and sometimes meant diplomacy, and sometimes meant simply being the most capable man in a room full of men who were less so. He had kept the West together through a combination of skill and careful improvisation that from a distance might have looked like stability. What he could not fully manage was the growing sense in Attila's court that the West represented something unfinished. The old arrangement, the quiet understanding, the hired cavalry, the mutual usefulness had served its time. Attila had no need now to offer his riders in exchange for Roman favor. He had enough gold, enough loyalty, enough organized force that the old calculus had changed entirely. What Attilas had once been able to offer him, Attila could now obtain or compel by other means. The understanding between them had been built on a particular balance of need, and that balance was no longer what it had been. There were still diplomatic exchanges, there were still envoys moving between courts, still the formal language of alliance and negotiation. But beneath that language, something had quietly shifted in the way Attila was looking at the Western provinces, at Gaul in particular, with its long river valleys and its wealthy cities, and at the question of what claim, if any, he might eventually choose to press. Aetius watched this from Ravenna and from the field, and he understood it perhaps better than anyone else in the Western court. He had known Attila when they were both younger men navigating worlds that were not entirely their own. He had some sense of how Attila thought of what moved him, and what held him still, and what he saw now in the quieter signals arriving from the east was not reassurance. The direction of Attila's attention had begun to shift. The questions his envoys were asking had begun to change in ways that were small but not difficult to read. The east had been the first direction Attila turned. It had given him what he asked for. Now his gaze was slowly finding the west, and the west was older and warier and thinner along its edges than the east had ever been. Aetius had spent years preparing for threats. He had spent years managing them, shaping them, turning them gradually into something he could work with. But what was gathering now, somewhere beyond the Danube and across the wide middle of the world, was something that would require more than management. It would require a choice, and the time for making it was drawing closer with every season that passed without a word that meant what it said. While all of this was slowly taking shape, something else was unfolding inside the walls of the imperial court itself, something quieter and more personal, and entirely its own. There was a woman in Ravenna who had spent most of her life waiting for something to happen. Her name was Honoria. She was the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian, and she had grown up surrounded by ceremony and restriction, and the quiet, relentless pressure of a life arranged entirely around what she was not permitted to do. She was imperial blood. She was valuable in the way that objects are valuable, not for what they choose, but for what they represent. And she had known, for a very long time, that the life being prepared for her was not one she had chosen. She had already caused difficulty once before. A few years earlier, an affair with one of her household officials had been discovered, and the court had responded without warmth. The man was removed. Honoria was confined more closely. An engagement was arranged to a senator, a man chosen for his steadiness, his dullness, his complete absence of any quality that might lead to further trouble. The wedding had not yet taken place, but the understanding was clear. This was where her life was going. This was the shape that had been decided for her. And so, sometime around the year 450, Honoria did something that no one in the Western court had anticipated. She sent a letter east, not to a Roman ally, not to a church official, not to anyone within the familiar orbit of imperial diplomacy. She sent it to Attila, and with the letter, she sent a ring. The exact words of that letter have not survived. What has survived is the shape of what she asked, or what Attila later claimed she asked. She was appealing to him for his help invention, perhaps for something closer to rescue. The ring, in the custom of the time, carried a meaning that could be read as a proposal, and Attila read it exactly that way. Whether Honoria truly intended a proposal, or whether she was simply reaching for the most powerful arm she could find in a moment of desperation, is something the distance of centuries makes impossible to know. She may have been calculating, she may have been frightened, she may have been both at once, a woman who understood, clearly enough, that the only person in the world with the standing to disrupt what was being arranged for her was the man on the other side of the Danube. What she could not have fully understood was how perfectly her letter arrived. Attila had been watching the West for some time. He had seen its thinning edges. He had noted the weariness in its courts, the difficulty Attilas was having, holding the old alliances together, the way the Western provinces had begun to feel less like a unified thing, and more like a collection of arrangements that might slowly come apart. He had not yet found the right opening, the right moment, the right justification. A man who had spent years inside Roman courts understood that justification mattered, that the way a thing was framed shaped how the world received it. And here, arriving quietly from inside the walls of the imperial family itself, was a frame. He sent word back to Ravenna. Honoria was his betrothed. He said, the ring was proof of the agreement, and as her intended husband, he was entitled to half of the Western Empire as a dowry. The court in Ravenna received this with something close to disbelief. Valentinian was furious. Honoria was moved under closer guard. The engagement to the senator was quietly accelerated. But none of that changed the message Attila had already sent, or the claim he had already made. He had no intention of withdrawing it. He had no interest in whether Ravenna accepted it or not. What he had was a reason, a stated grievance, a formal demand, a position from which he could now move. The Hunnic army began to gather in the late months of 450. It was a force assembled from across the vast middle of the world. Hunnic riders, subject peoples, Germanic warriors who had been drawn into the orbit of Attila's power over the years. Their loyalty had been maintained through a combination of reward and the simple understanding that Attila was the most formidable thing moving across the landscape. The numbers that have come down through history are almost certainly larger than the reality, as numbers in old accounts tend to be. But the force was real, and it was large, and it moved with the kind of organized purpose that Attila had been steadily refining for years. He crossed the Rhine in the early months of 451. The western provinces had known something was coming. The signals had been building long enough that no one with eyes on the east could claim surprise. But knowing and being ready are not the same thing. The Hunnic force moved through the northern provinces with a steadiness that left very little time for the kind of careful preparation that might have made a difference. Cities fell. Some were abandoned before the army arrived. Others held briefly and then did not. The long river valleys of Gaul, which Attila had been watching from a distance for years, now had his riders moving slowly through them. The wealthy cities that had seemed from the eastern plains like something worth reaching, they were being reached. Attius was already moving. He had spent years building toward exactly this moment, gathering the alliances he had been quietly tending, calling in the arrangements he had made with the Visigothic king Theodoric, and others who understood, as he did, that what was moving through Gaul was not simply a raid, it was a reckoning. And somewhere in the wide fields of northern Gaul, near a place called the Catalonian Plains, those two forces were slowly finding each other. The summer of 4051 was drawing close, and with it, the moment that Attila had been preparing for, the one meeting on open ground between everything he had built and everything Attila had become. The fields of northern Gaul in midsummer are wide and pale. The grass stretches in long, slow waves, and the sky above them seems to go on without any particular intention of stopping. It is the kind of landscape that holds sound differently than a forest does. Sound travels across it, spreads thin, and arrives from a distance before the thing making it can be seen. On a morning in the summer of 451, those fields would have carried the sound of an enormous number of people and animals moving toward one another across the open ground. There is something almost still about a moment just before it breaks. The two forces had been drawing together for days, each aware of the other, each adjusting its position across the wide plain near what the old accounts call the Catalonian fields. Attila had chosen his ground carefully, as he always did. Attila had chosen his ground carefully, as he always did. It had taken years of patient work, conversations held in the right order, promises made with the right weight behind them, the slow construction of trust between peoples who had no natural reason to stand together. The Visigoths, under their aging king Theodoric, were the heart of it. They had their own reasons for opposing Attila, reasons that had been building quietly for some time. Attila had not created those reasons. He had simply found them and given them a direction. Attila understood what he was facing. He had spent enough years watching the way power gathered and dispersed to know that the force across the plain from him was not a Roman army in the old sense. It was something assembled from many parts, held together by the skill of one man and the shared recognition that what Attila represented could not be accommodated indefinitely. He knew Attila. He had known him for a long time, and that knowledge moved in both directions. He understood the man's abilities as clearly as Attila understood his. The battle, when it came, did not resolve itself quickly or cleanly. It moved across the wide ground in sections, different parts of the line pressing and yielding at different moments, the way large engagements on open terrain tend to do. Attila had positioned his own Hunnic riders at the center, as he always did. They were the core of everything he had built, the element he trusted most completely. The flanks were held. By evening, Attila's force had drawn back to its camp. The wagons had been arranged in a wide defensive circle, the way the Hunnic people had always done when the open ground no longer favored them. Inside that perimeter, Attila waited. The accounts that have come down through the centuries describe him as composed, not broken, not desperate, but still and watchful, already considering what the next movement would be. Attila did not press the assault through the night. Some of the explanations for this have to do with the losses his own side had taken during the day. Others have to do with what Attila needed from this moment. In a longer sense, a weakened Attila may have served him better than a destroyed one, given the other forces that were always moving quietly through the western court. Whatever the reason, the night passed without the final collision that might have ended everything. In the morning, the Hunnic force was still there. And then, gradually, it was not. Attila began to withdraw, not in disorder, not in the scattered way of a broken army, but with the same organized deliberateness that had marked his movements for years. The withdrawal was a retreat, and everyone who watched it understood that. But it was also something Attila had chosen, on his own terms, at a moment of his own selection. The Catalonian fields was the one day in all of Attila's campaigns that did not end the way his other days had ended. He had not been destroyed. His force was still whole, still capable, still loyal. But he had not won. The Allied line had held, and the ground he had come to claim remained unclaimed, for a man who had built his entire authority on the understanding that he moved, and the world moved with him. That was a different kind of result than he had ever had to carry before. And yet he carried it. He moved his army back across the Rhine and into the eastern territories, and the world watched to see what he would do next. The alliance that Attila had assembled began to loosen almost immediately. Theodoric's son had a kingdom to return to, and the careful arrangements that had held so many different peoples together had been built for this one moment, not for an extended campaign. Cyrus found himself, in the aftermath of the one day he had stopped Attila, with fewer pieces in his hands than he had held before. Attila rested through the autumn. He gathered his strength and watched the western provinces settle back into their ordinary rhythms. And somewhere in the quiet of that waiting, he turned his attention south. There was still a half of the Western world he had not yet moved through. There was still a claim he had not withdrawn. Italy was there, just beyond the mountains, and the season for moving was not far away. He crossed the Alps in the early part of the year 452, moving his army through the mountain passes while the snow was still retreating from the higher ground. The path was narrow and slow. The mountains held a particular kind of silence, the kind that gathers in high places and does not lift easily. Below, the Italian plain waited, wide and green, and almost entirely undefended. Rome had sent no army to the passes. There was no force waiting at the foot of the mountains to meet him. The Western Empire had spent what it had at the Catalonian fields, and what remained was scattered and thin, stretched across provinces that all needed holding at once and could not all be held. Attila descended into northern Italy with the same deliberate patience he had always carried. His first objective was Aquileia, a city that stood near the head of the Adriatic, large and well-walled and important enough that taking it would announce his presence to everything south of it. The siege lasted through the summer months. The city resisted longer than most had expected, and then it did not resist anymore. When Attila moved on, Aquileia was left behind him as a kind of silence, not a ruin described in detail, but a name that other cities heard and understood. The news moved faster than his army did. Milan fell, then Padua, then Verona. One by one, the cities of the northern plain either opened their gates or found that it made no difference whether they did. The populations that could move, moved. Some going south, some making their way toward the lagoons along the coast, to the marshy islands where horses could not easily follow. They stayed long enough that the staying became permanent. What grew there later, slowly and over many generations, would become something no one in 452 could have imagined. But that is a story that belongs to a different kind of evening. What mattered in the summer of 452 was that Attila was moving south through Italy, and the city of Rome lay open ahead of him. The Emperor Valentinian had already left. He had gone to Ravenna, which was surrounded by marshland, and considered more defensible, and he governed the Western Empire from behind those natural walls, while the man he could not stop moved steadily toward the old capital. There was no Roman general riding out to meet Attila in the field. Aetius, who had stopped him once, did not have the forces to stop him again. Not here, not now, not with what remained. The situation was not a battle waiting to happen. It was something quieter and more difficult than that. And so it was not a soldier who rode out to meet Attila. It was a bishop. Pope Leo I came to Attila somewhere near the river Mincio, in the summer heat of the Italian plain, accompanied by a small group of Roman officials and nothing else that could be called protection. He was an old man by the standards of his time. He had built his authority entirely through words, through the slow, patient work of making the church in Rome into something that commanded attention even from those who did not share its faith. He rode out without an army, because there was no army to bring. What he carried was his office, his voice, and whatever it was that made him believe the meeting was worth attempting. What passed between them is not fully known. The sources describe a meeting, and they describe Attila withdrawing afterward, but they do not preserve the conversation in any form that can be trusted completely. Leo's own account, written later, speaks of a presence felt in that place, of something that made Attila unwilling to continue. The Hunnic side left no written record of the meeting at all. What history has prior is the outcome. Attila turned back. He did not move on Rome. He did not march his army to the walls of the city that had defined the Western world for centuries. He accepted terms, a tribute, a promise, some arrangement that satisfied whatever calculation he was making, and he began the long movement north again, back toward the passes, back toward the plains beyond. The reasons have been considered ever since, and none of them alone seems quite sufficient. His army had been moving and fighting through a long season, and northern Italy in summer carried illness in ways that the open steppe never had. There is evidence that sickness had been moving through the Hunnic camp, thinning the force quietly in ways that no battle had managed to do. There was also the matter of the Eastern Empire, which had a new emperor by this point, and was already shifting its posture, already considering whether a Hunnic army deep in Italy might represent an opening on the Danube frontier that would not come again soon. Attila was aware, as he had always been aware, of the full shape of the world he was moving through, not just the ground directly ahead, but everything behind him and to either side. And then there was Leo himself. Something in that meeting gave Attila reason enough to turn, whether it was the terms offered or the recognition that Italy had already given him what a season of movement could give, or something in the old man's manner that shifted the weight of the moment. It is not possible now to say with certainty. What remains is the image of two men meeting on a summer plain, one with an army and one without, and the one without the army being the one who walked away with what he needed. Rome did not fall that year. The city that had been given as a reason to march west remained standing, untouched, as Attila moved back through the mountains into the world he had come from. He had not needed to destroy the Western Empire. He had walked to its edge, looked at it, and turned away on his own terms, and the empire was left to consider what that meant about its own condition. The tribute was agreed, the claim on Honoria was not formally abandoned, and Attila returned to his territory in the east, where the next season was already beginning to take shape in his mind. He would not live to see another one. He came back to his own lands in the autumn of that year, moving north through the mountain passes as the light began to change and the air grew cooler. The plains received him as they always had, wide and unhurried, the long grass bending in the wind, the horizon stretching away in every direction without edge or interruption. He had spent years moving against the most powerful structures the world had assembled, and now he was home again, surrounded by the people who had followed him across all of it. Whatever he was planning next, he kept mostly to himself. There were signs of preparation, the kind of quiet gathering that always preceded a new season of movement. Some accounts suggest his attention had shifted back toward Constantinople, toward the new arrangement that had taken shape there in his absence. Others suggest he was still holding the claim on Honoria, still carrying that letter from the Western princess as a reason to return. He was a man who rarely let go of a position until he had found a use for it. But the next campaign never came. In the early months of 45-3, Attila took a new wife. Her name was Ildiko. The wedding was held in the manner of the Hunnic nobility, a long celebration, fires burning through the night, chieftains and their families gathering from across the territory he had spent his life assembling. It was the kind of occasion that marked not just a marriage, but a statement of continuity. A leader still at the center of everything, still the fixed point around which the whole world of the steppe turned. He was found the following morning. He had not emerged from his tent, and when those waiting outside finally entered, they found him lying still. Ildiko was nearby, weeping. He had died in the night. There was no wound. There was no sign of struggle. The accounts that survive describe something that sounds, across the distance of 15 centuries, like a vessel giving way somewhere inside him, blood moving into the wrong spaces while he slept. He may have been drinking heavily the night before, as was the custom at such celebrations. He may have been older and more worn than anyone around him had allowed themselves to consider. He was gone, the man who had made two empires pay tribute, who had walked an army to the edge of Rome and turned away on his own terms. He died quietly in his tent on the night of his wedding, with no enemy near him and no battle left unfinished. The mourning that followed was unlike anything the Hunnic world had held before. His warriors cut their own hair and marked their faces, not with the usual signs of grief, but with wounds, so that the greatest warrior they had ever known would be mourned in blood rather than tears. He was carried to his burial place in a coffin, said to be layered in gold and iron and wood, one inside the other. The men who buried him were killed afterward, so that the location would remain hidden. It has never been found. What came after him unraveled with a speed that he would likely have understood, even if he could not have stopped it. His sons, and there were many, divided the territory among themselves. The divisions became rivalries. The rivalries became small wars. And within a generation, the Hunnic Confederation had broken apart into the separate peoples it had always been, held together only by force of will. The thing Attila had built was not a state or an institution. It was a relationship between one man and the loyalty he had earned. And when the man was gone, the loyalty scattered like smoke. Attila, the Roman general who had known Attila longest and understood him best, survived only a short while longer. He was killed by the emperor he had served, not in battle but in a palace, by a man who had grown afraid of the power Attila had gathered. The Western Empire lost its most capable defender within 2 years of losing its most capable adversary. The two losses together left something irreplaceable missing from the world that remained. The Western Empire continued for a little longer, another 20 years or so, but the shape of it had already changed in ways that could not be reversed. The pressure Attila had applied, season after season, had not broken the walls of Rome. It had done something quieter and more lasting. It had shown everyone watching, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the peoples along the northern edges, that the empire could be made to yield, that it would pay, that the distance between its power and its fear was smaller than anyone had believed before. Attila began measuring it. He had never claimed to be building something permanent. He had moved through the world the way the steppe itself moved, in long, slow patterns, following the season, taking what the ground offered, and leaving when the ground had nothing more to give. He understood power, not as a structure to be raised and defended, but as a current to be read and followed, and he had read it more clearly than anyone around him. What he left behind was not an empire, it was a silence, the particular kind that follows something large and irreversible. When the world is still deciding what shape it will take next, the plains he rode back to that final autumn are still there, still wide, still bending in the wind. The name he carried is still spoken, still recognized, still holding the weight he gave it across 15 centuries of distance. Not because he destroyed Rome, but because he looked at it, found what it was made of underneath, and let it live with that knowledge. Thank you for being here tonight. Good night.